Welcome to Big Closet Small Planet and this special edition for the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action's Climate Action Week. I'm particularly excited about this conversation we're about to have because we have Lewis Perkins, who is the president and CEO of the Apparel Impact Institute. I think that's the correct title, Lewis. With us today, I think Apparel Impact Institute, given what I've seen over the bunch of years that have passed, is a very important player in this space, and for a number of reasons that we're going to discuss. And so it was pretty obvious that in this Climate Action Week, we needed to have Lewis on to give us some insights on their work and how he sees the situation as it is now, and both from a positive and perhaps challenging point of view. So very glad to have him with us. Lewis, without further ado, I think it's probably best you confirm your title
I will.
and your role and what a little bit what you do at AAI for those who are new but shouldn't actually be new to this. Just tell us who you are.
Thanks, Mike. Well, it's great to be back with you too. So thank you for the invitation. So yes, I'm Lewis Perkins, President and CEO at Apparel Impact Institute, and the role that we play in the industry is really as a actor convener, but toward deployment of decarbonization and other sustainability initiatives. And if you look at our mission statement, it says we identify, fund, scale, and measure proven solutions towards making the fashion industry more sustainable. And specifically what that means for us and what we've narrowed in on is the work that you're so close to, Mike, as well, which is the decarbonization of the lowering of carbon emissions from the production of our apparel. And that includes, from raw materials all the way through the cut and sew. And so we've been really looking at ourselves as an organization that plays, I won't call it the last mile, but it's this important missing mile that is getting good solutions from pilot phase into commercially viable, scalable phase. And I think the last phase is when the flywheel is rolling and you can exit as an AII, and the case has been made and every supplier is taking on the investment necessary to transition. And I look forward to that last mile. What I would say is we're the next to that, which is taking the good projects and solutions and programs and ensuring that they have proven models that we can get technology scale. And I'll dive more into what that means and how we're doing that, but that's kind of at the highest level.
Okay. And I mean, I would say that is clearly where your focus is.
Yes.
But you also, I think, play an additional role in some of your analysis and reports, I think, because some of your collaborations with other organizations have set the sort of baseline for the emissions in the industry, taking stock of where it's at, where we need to be. So there is a degree of thought leadership and sort of overall industry strategy that you are driving as well. Do you agree with me?
I do. And, it's interesting. I sometimes de-emphasize, I don't mean to de-emphasize that, but only because I want to really position that we're about action. And that isn't to say that a lot of other organizations that are out there doing convening and bringing and setting strategy and putting together thought leadership aren't critical. In fact, they're so critical that we don't want to duplicate those efforts. We want to be able to amplify and then roll forward to, at the end of the day, what I want to do is have more suppliers taking on these projects and programs that are going to actually lower their environmental impact. But you bring up a really important point, which is oftentimes we find that until we have clarity as a community of practice, which is everyone from the NGO, MSI community that we're in to the brand retailers, the suppliers, the banks, the development banks, the philanthropies, everybody needs to kind of say, are we looking at this in the same way? And most of the time we have 10 points of view, and sort of arbitrarily grabbing that number out of the air, but we have multiple points of view that don't always align. And I think where we've always said is we want to be a data-driven, science-based organization, starting with, that our founding was to take Higg data and from the facility modules, and really take that data and analyze how do we use those insights to drive action. And from that, and you mentioned one of the first reports that we felt was critical was to complement the work that was happening with Science Based Targets Initiative specifically for this sector, and to complement the work that was happening under the UNFCCC Fashion Charter, which was to say, do we actually know where the carbon is? Do we agree that it's in these stages of production, these types of materials, these areas for intervention? And we call that the levers to pull. If we could identify the levers to pull in the sector and we would agree on them, then we could go after the carbon in a more efficient and systematic way. And so that thought leadership was important because we needed it. Without some level of agreement, we couldn't get there. And then from there, multiple reports have continued where we say, in order for us to be more effective in our strategy and to really encourage our stakeholders, brands, retailers, banks, et cetera, to do the work, we need to make sure that we have the information we need to do that. And so that's our theory around our thought leadership is generally we need this research anyway. Let's publish it and make it available to everyone.
And I think that should not be underestimated, that key assumption that you said, which is if we don't have a common worldview, a common view of what we're talking about, then
Yeah.
there's a lot of ad hoc stuff going on, people arguing this or that, and so I know you talk about action, but I think those are pretty critical pieces to the whole industry having at least some sort of a common point of departure. Otherwise, I don't think you can get there. So
I agree.
just to emphasize that, I also wanted to lift up that at least as I recall, and the reports I've read, there is a goal that you've set for AI in terms of carbon or GHG reductions, right?
There is.
And the
Yeah.
goal, as I've understood it, is 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent saved over the useful life by 2030. Is that still the goal? Is that the
It is, and
aim?
I want to sort of quantify and qualify that statement because when I say that's AII's goal, that means that is AII's goal for its partners, right? And so when I stood on the stage, I think it's now 2022, 3 years ago. It's only 3 years ago, and announced the launch of this Fashion Climate Fund that would effectively identify and reduce 100 million tons of CO2 emission. It was a call to everyone in the room and everyone who would listen, right? And everyone who wasn't in the room but needed to play a role. And it was about, let's pool the money. Let's go after the carbon in this systematic way that we've identified. Where is it? And let's rapidly reduce the CO2 emission, against the most proven or ready to scale solutions. And then if we do this, we would in effect touch somewhere between 1,800 to 2,000 suppliers. And those suppliers would represent, modeling it out, on average 100 million tons of CO2 emission reduction. So that is a goal that we maintain for the industry. And why I always make that distinction is I think too often, goals are set by organizations that we're only able to do it if everybody steps up and says we want to be a part of this, right?
Right. And that makes sense. I also think we should put it in some sort of perspective, which is 100 million tons. You've also, though, have data that says if you're talking about where we need to be as an industry by 2030,
Yep.
100 million tons is not what we need. We need more than that, right? So,
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's,
we need sort
yeah.
of to be at 0.490 gigatons or something like that by 2030.
Yeah.
And so the reason I bring that up is because on one hand, you're saying we're being ambitious and this is sort of what we need if we mobilize everyone. At the same time, you're also being conservative, right? You're saying we can't take responsibility for the whole industry's emissions. So
Right.
this is what we think we could do given what we think is possible, given our relationships, what we are capable of. Is that how you thought about it?
It is, and I'll tell you, it's been refined in the 3 years because I think when we launched it, we thought, all right, let's get in there. We had a very strong initiative under the Clean by Design program and other mill improvement programs we partnered with to say we have something right now we can scale that will reduce CO2 emission on average by 10% if you roll this efficiency program through your primarily mills, but we also touch tiers 1 and 3. And and so we knew that, but then I started, as we thought about it, do we just want to raise and spend this kind of money on what we know, or is it critical that we play the role for the industry of finding, and this goes back to the mission statement, finding those things that are interventions, whether it's equipment, technology, programs, other types of solutions that would be identified through the industry and or other industries that are solving for thermal heat and electricity and these types of same issues. We would want to be the tip of the spear. And so part of it would be we could go one or two ways. We could try to roll out efficiency programs to as many suppliers as possible to get, but the reality is what the industry really needs, because an efficiency program should be table stakes now. It should be like, this works, you should do it. Your suppliers are going to get an ROI back on this. It's relatively short, 14 months on average. So what do we need to do is play the role of, what do we know about this solution? What do we know about heat pump technology? How are we going to electrify boilers? Where's the technology on battery storage? All this stuff that's kind of at the cusp and probably is working in other sectors or has been tested, but there's no visibility to, how did it do? And do we want to try it again in 5 more facilities in this region? And how does that apply to the local policies? And so to answer your question, I think what we've now realized is, yes, we want to advocate for scaling as many low-hanging fruit efficiency programs as possible, but where we would be the most powerful is to play the role of getting enough proof points around those technologies that are ready to scale, to prove they're commercially viable, to demonstrate the financial models that got it across the finish line, the relationship to the suppliers that would actually, between the brand retailers and the suppliers, that would actually move the needle. And that if AII could play that role, we could then be replicated, which is really what we want, is to have all this stuff available to suppliers to take on their own.
So, like any good startup that's moving in this direction, you're evolving
Yes.
based on what you've learned from your work and what's needed.
Yes.
Makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you, because we want to get into sort of where we are now based on your experience. But I'm wondering where I should start. I think I want to start with still this strategy discussion, and then I want to come into your 2024 impact report. So I'm going to start there, which is, you and I have talked about this. I know you're very conscious about sort of staying not necessarily in one lane, but in a lane so that there's other actors doing different things. But my own experience has been, well, who's developing the strategy for the industry, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I know that that's sort of potentially a sensitive subject to say, well, this is our lane, this is what we do best, here's our mission statement. But in some ways, although I haven't been active in the discussions directly with you, I've been thinking for many years, like, well, who's sort of organizing the whole industry with a strategy that's going to have a macro impact?
Yeah.
And so when you started to talk about, let's identify the best available data, which some would argue is the Higg data, where the most sort of the biggest carbon emitters are in the industry.
Yeah.
And let's identify them. And then instead of sort of spreading ourselves thin and making everyone work with us, we're going to focus on where we get the most ROI on those, was it 1,800 or so biggest emitters? To me, that's sort of at least, a smart proposal, which is here are sort of overall where we need to focus for the time being. And here's an industry strategy. So in that respect, I think that this is your approach is quite industry wide and essential. How have you thought about that 1,800, and is that still where your mind is at now?
Yes. And if you, depending on which materials of ours you may read. You may see 1,500, you may see 2,000. What it represents is that we have identified roughly 1,800 using Higg data of the highest CO2 emission reduction. And we also know that we want to hit, most of those are large volume, large direct producers in their scope 3 that may be vertically integrated, may not be. But so it's looking at the largest players in many cases. But we also know that for us to be an effective organization, we need to demonstrate the transition that small, medium enterprises would take to. So to get to the 2,000, whether you're talking about AI rolling out 1,500 programs to 1,500 suppliers or 1,800, we would make up the gap to 2,000 with SMEs. That's the intent. So just kind of keep that in your head. And so I think you're right. And using the best data set that we had available, but complementing that with a couple of things, which is many of these brands are still collecting their own data from their suppliers and complementing that with FEM data. And so if a brand retailer either isn't a member of Cascale or using the Higg tools or has those data sets available to them from their suppliers, which they should, because most of the suppliers are probably asked to do that from other partners they work with on the brand retailer side. But if they don't, we can obviously leverage data from other brand retailers that they've collected. There's other sources, but we always go in and we quantify it. So we always do a carbon tech assessment when we start with them. And so one of the first things that we'll do is get updated data on that. So that's important because I think that for a long time, people in the sector were sort of pointing at making perfect the enemy of the good around data, and just know that, we're always intending to collect real on-site data as we collect this work. And then obviously, as you roll out a program, an upgrade, an efficiency, replacing equipment, you're tracking, the impact of that. And that becomes the report back. And that's what shows up in our impact report is the data on that. But so yes, I that's kind of that's where those numbers come from, and that's kind of our strategy is to, again, we want to create this sort of flywheel where if we have enough proof points by 2030, it sets the stage for what AII can do to 2040, but it also sets the stage what the industry can take on its own. And I'll say one other thing, which is because we've created this pooled funding mechanism with the Fashion Climate Fund, which, by the way, every brand retailer that's working with us is in effect pooling those resources into this common fund, because we're matchmaking other brand retailers that are in their suppliers. We're looking at how to create greater efficiencies around that. And so we've created this sort of vessel whereby we can drive some of that funding specifically towards the tip of the spear, as I say, and some of these bigger next level up CapEx, larger CO2 emission reduction initiatives. Or we can also apply that still to efficiency programs and other things and support what a supplier may be looking for. And so we can get to that too, because another part of our strategic shift or refinement has really been to engage the supplier in understanding what is your strategy, what have you researched, what are you looking to change, and how can we help support and also potentially finance or fund that transition for you.
And I think that is a theme that has popped up, of course, again and again in terms of brand top-down prescriptive, here's what you should do, towards shouldn't the suppliers, and we also have workers down the line there, be more in the lead in determining what works for them. But we can come back to that. I'm just going to stay one more time on a macro scale before we get into your 2024 impact report conclusions. But the reason I bring it up is that, I think it's important at some level to figure out who it is who's taking responsibility for the industry. You can push back if you disagree, because there are so many countries and stakeholders and people around the world who are impacted. And at one level, you think, well, it should be governments, right? Like the EU needs to set a target for CO2 reductions for the textile industry in the EU and such. The US, states, etc. Or is it sort of organizations like Apparel Impact Institute, or is it the Fashion Charter? And there seems to have been this sort of who's is this falling between the stools kind of thing, where Do we have a clear success goal for Bangladesh in terms
Mm-hmm.
of where the reduction should be by when, and how, who's in charge of following that up? Do we have it for the EU? Do we have it for the US? And so the reason I bring it up is I think that while those things I don't see are there, certain countries may be getting there. Because I know the EU is not how quantified targets, right? They haven't said
Mm-hmm.
here's where we need to be by 2030 for the industry on GHGs.
Right.
Um, you guys come in, and it's helpful to say, well, at least here's a strategy that could work for the industry as we focus on these 1,800. They're higher emitters. This could be a model that the whole industry uses. So, does that resonate at all with you, that there's some need for that? Because I think even the Fashion Charter, which we have been a part of, is
Mm-hmm.
trying to bring in companies to help with the national determined sort of contributions to reductions, but no
Yep.
one's setting industry target, science-based targets at the national level, at the industry level in these different countries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All of a sudden, the light bulbs in my head are going off as you mentioned. There's so many pieces of work that I think are missing and probably critical. And the answer is that something that AII should do? Is that something that we should do in partnership with a couple of organizations, which I also advocate for, because I think that, and we're working on a couple reports right now on the cost of inaction and bringing in a couple other partners in the sector around that, because I think the more it can be seen, and this is stepping a little bit into maybe the politics of it all, but it's also important that the industry has resourced several of us to take on this work. And I think that oftentimes it's looked like we're not necessarily working alongside each other or as aligned as we probably are. And we probably are talking and working together more, but trying to also have swim lanes and figure out who does what. And so you're planting a seed, because I do think country level targets and ambitions are important. And if we can actually kind of bring a couple key lead partners together in the MSI NGO space to lead that conversation for the brand retailers who are funding all of us and who are either members or stakeholders to our work, that would be pretty powerful, because I do think it's lacking, and it feels like it is a good extension of the work that you guys have been doing around policy over at the Fashion Charter as well too.
So let's jump into your insights from the impact report, and we can come back to some of those things you just raised. Are there things you want to highlight in the report? Successes, concerns, insights?
Yeah, I thank you. I think overall, there's sort of two things that are happening, and we have even more data that's coming in around how the industry is doing around this work. I think that we're proud of the fact that we have increased the amount of CO2 emission reduction year over year that we're able to pull from primarily manufacturing, but also farms, because we have rolled out some projects with the greenhouse gas equivalent work in the farm level. And so when we look at the growth of AII as a player and demonstrating that we're expanding beyond efficiency work, and we're starting to look at you know, uh, new ways in which we can also help the industry reduce even more carbon. I think that's been successful. And to an extent, it's never going to feel like it's fast enough, particularly because the sector is also growing. And so the overall emissions of the sector continue to grow. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more, which is the conundrum of growth and degrowth against profits, and how, where does the carbon emission strategy fit within all of that? But I think that's something that we can't solve for necessarily at AII, but it's something that we have to be increasingly aware of, which is the urgency around the reduction. So when I looked at the results pulled together for our report, and what story does it tell? I think it tells a powerful story of a group of stakeholders who've come together to move the needle even further year over year, But that lands also within a landscape of many suppliers and brand retailers who are not yet accelerating this work to the extent that they should be.
And I want to point out that in other conversations, I had a conversation with Peter Ford and among others. There was a sense of optimism at one level, which was, and I don't know if you share it, that there are a number of companies who are leading the way and pulling the rest of the industry with them,
Yes,
as he describes it. He also was very optimistic, which I was caught by surprise about. Suddenly, one particular technology, sort of waterless dyeing, has now moved from pilot to something that could be scaled, which
amazing.
we've been waiting for about 15, 20 years. I've heard that. But he's saying on the ground from his experience, he thinks this is real now.
Yeah.
So I'm not asking you as the president of CEO to give me sort of feedback on specific solutions or technologies, but there has been a sense that even despite more action by a majority of the industry, that there's these leading players that are working with Apparel Impact Institute driving this, they seem to have moved the needle for the industry quite a lot just themselves. Uh,
Yes.
do you think that's a fair assessment?
I will say, and you've known me long enough to know that I actually am very much an optimist, and I choose to live to do this work. I choose to live in the space of looking for the
What a
positive and being
sucker.
excited about the wins. Otherwise, I don't know that I could do it, right?
No, of
Because
course
it
not.
is daunting and it's huge. But to your point, I have not seen the level of I guess we're having the right conversations now. And around right down to which technologies, right down to carbon intensity, to following the carbon, to making smart decisions that are going to actually have impact. And we've raised the bar in terms of the literacy of this topic within the brand retailer and the supplier in a way that, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it just wasn't there. And I think it's a sign of the maturity of the sector. At the same time, I think that one would have liked to have seen this a lot further along in terms of momentum and adoption by more and more industry players. But we haven't proven the case that, the problem is, and we've known this all along, we've treated sustainability separate from some of the other KPIs related to sourcing. And it's always been a dream or vision to have sustainability and on the scorecard in a way that actually made purchasing decisions impacted purchasing decisions or sourcing decisions. And I think we're at a stage now where the leaders, as you mentioned, are making this much more part of their overall sourcing strategy as we look forward. And it's, with we can get into the geopolitical conversation or not, but you do have to say, with what's happened in the last few months around tariffs from the U.S. and the threat of all that impact, I've been surprised to not see everybody retreat and use it as an opportunity to abandon or drop the work. But if anything, what I'm witnessing now, and ask me again in 6 to 12 months, but what I'm witnessing now is a doubling down, not vocally. There's not press releases coming out saying we're doubling down on our sustainability. But what those of us who are behind the curtain are seeing from the leaders, and this is what you're really pointing, is that that level of not only does this not get dropped, we believe in this now more than ever, and a competitive landscape for the future, and the ability for us to de-risk our future as a brand retailer that's sourcing in these countries and regions is to ensure that we're attaching our practices to sustainability. So where I think that this lands, and probably we could have predicted this 15 years ago, is you don't need 250 brand retailers to get this work done. You don't even need 50. And I almost hesitate to say this because somebody's going to hear this and think they're off the hook. Reality is, I hope if you aren't on the right side of climate history, your brand goes down in flames. I think that the reality is, we know that the consumer probably is more fickle and not going to hold you as accountable as we wish long term for your good or bad sustainability practices. But the reality is, I think that a lot of these bigger players that are taking leadership are the ones that will transition the sector. They're large enough to do it. You need 10 of them, 15 of them, and in the right countries together, and you bundle them by geographic focus, and you go after this. You impact policy, you impact, future proofing the textile production industry in that country, and you attach sustainability to it, and that's what's going to happen, I think, and that is what I think is happening. What I'll say to the brand retailer that just heard that and thinks they're off the hook, you don't want to be. You really want to, because ultimately, and we're working on this now, which is the cost of inaction for not doing this work. You're going to benefit better if you do invest in sustainability long term for your supply chain and sourcing from them. There's a shadow effect that if the suppliers are taking on this work on behalf of other customers, but you are going to still source from them, obviously you'll get the benefit of that. But ultimately, I think true leadership and an opportunity to be a leader is to participate in it. And not everyone's going to be able to allocate millions into a fund like Fashion Climate Fund or other cool projects and initiatives that are out there where brand retailers are being asked to tap into corporate treasury to get some of this work going. But anything counts, right? Anything that you put into this work and demonstrate your legitimate dedication to helping the suppliers that you source from become more sustainable for long-term sustainable production is going to be credited towards this work, I believe.
So you talked about putting in money from the treasury, and so
Yeah.
we've talked for a number of years. One of the big thing was, who's going to pay? How much is this going to cost? One of the reports with Fashion for Good that I helped generate, as I recall in the discussions, was about the $1 trillion opportunity,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Um, and so there's been this big issue of money. It's about money, and of course I look at the report from 2024, and you want to unlock $2 billion in capital by 2030, and the visual is showing a few dollar signs, but not nearly close, right? 7.8 per one, 7.81% of the goal achieved.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, I mean, we knew this was going to be incredibly hard.
Yeah.
So that's not a surprise. But is money still the key component to success? And the reason I ask that is because I know that there's also this project with benchmarking for the industry.
Yep.
And the thought was like, okay, it's not that we don't want to rely on legislation, but we can't wait. We need some way of moving the industry to particular best practices and moving sort of buyers to factories that are doing good work, so they benefit from doing their good work. And so maybe benchmarking, even though it's not going to be set, in the next 6 months, maybe this is a way of getting the industry to drive the change on its own without the money and without the legislation. So is the money still crucial at the level that it was? You could say yes, it's
It
still crucial.
all is, and ultimately, and if you go back into that report, and thank you for referencing it, the $1 trillion opportunity report. When I look at that report, and there's one particular graphic that sort of shows the stages of development from pre-seed pilot model to scale around these initiatives, and then it looks at the asset class or the type of funder to that, whether it's commercial bank dollars, philanthropic, brand retailer support, supplier treasury. When you look at them, what you want to do, and this models impact investing when looking at, the type of funding that comes in early stage is the person who's throwing a dart against a wall and says it's okay if I never get a dollar back from that, and then as you go further along, you're getting more viable as a technology solution or or company to become profitable in the case of impact investing, you're exiting out those early stage, and you're securing investors for your growth phase that are in it to make money, right? And so you hope that the early stage folks, obviously, all they need is a couple unicorns, and they're off to the races. But they recognize they're going to burn through a lot of money and fail fast on a lot of stuff that's not going to work. Same thing applies here. And what I really thought about when we set up the Fashion Climate Fund was we've got proven models. You're not wasting money on an efficiency program, but there's going to be some things that we're going to want to put some money into to see if we can get them to scale. And if AII is not focusing on the unproven, and this is why it's great to have partnerships with folks like Fashion for Good and others who can test out new technologies. You mentioned waterless dyeing, dry processing technologies. There's a lot of really interesting dye stuff technologies that should be piloted when we're not yet sure it's actually going to be viable. And then when we know that it is, there's still a need for that catalytic capital. And so I guess if I break it down, why do you still need philanthropic? Why do you still need money from early stage that is concessionary capital? It's because it's a hand holding of adoption. So let's look at it this way. We knew that solar panels worked. We knew that electric cars worked, but we needed more citizens to take them on. In the US, what we did was we created rebate programs, and we subsidized for more of you who will buy an EV car now or put solar panels on your rooftop. We will incentivize you by making it cheaper. That rebate pool is going to run out. So get to the gate now, because by the year such and such, you'll no longer be eligible. Or, first come, first serve. And I think that's where we are right now, is looking at, it's not that the case for that technology isn't proven. It's the case for why, as a supplier, would I take on debt when you haven't yet proven to me that that's going to be table stakes to remain a partner to you in producing your apparel. And
So
so
your model then in AI is also to share the financial risk then on these?
it's to share it up front right now while we
Yeah.
can get enough of the big heavy lift, high emitting carbon carbon emissions producing suppliers across the finish line, and enough SMEs. We need case studies to demonstrate this is how the financing worked. This is what it looked like. I think as much as it's about, and this is, you asked me about money, it's as much about the technology as it is the money that got it there, because the two go hand in hand, and they're both cumbersome. Implementing a new process or a new piece of equipment is just whether it works or not. And I remember this from my old carpet industry days, where we would have these circular carpet tiles created, but then the installer just couldn't not use the toxic glue they loved and been using for years, and then you negate the whole thing, right? So part of it is we gotta make it comfortable for the supplier to take on this technology in a way that it works within the people that are actually operating production. That in of itself is a challenge, right? Is
Right.
getting people comfortable with taking it on. But secondly, it's also getting those in the office upstairs comfortable with the finance to get there.
Yes.
And if we can make it more attractive today and say, hey, first to the table, we're going to pool funds for loan guarantees to potentially make if you are needing to borrow or finance this technology, we're going to make it more attractive. Potentially, we're going to look at some type of closing the gap on deploying that technology. That could be in the form of a rebate. That could be in the form of some kind of return once you've proven that that technology actually had impact, i.e., it reduced CO2 emission by X amount by X date. There could be some type of rebate. So we're looking at all types of models right now to complement the two. And in order to do that, I need that to be concessionary and or zero interest rate money. And the best
Okay.
place to get that from would be philanthropy. But I'll tell you, and this is another one, I think the philanthropic sector has done a lot of what they want to do to get this off the ground. Now, that's not true of philanthropy coming from brands that still has a potential role. But I think that the philanthropic community outside of this sector is ready for this sector to take care of its own business. And we've put enough money from partners out there into getting the foundation going. So it's really now the opportunity for corporate philanthropy attached to the industry, along with corporate treasury dollars, to participate in this early stage transition work.
Okay, so here's what I was sort of getting at, I think, which is, and I know you can just not answer this question because it's too politically sensitive.
Okay,
Maybe it's my chance to just say,
to say
oi,
it.
oi, oi. So we know there are very, very wealthy people in this industry, uh, very, very wealthy families in this industry. And it seems like the approach that we have to take is as you say, you've gotten some foundations from outside who are interested in the industry for other reasons to get you started. Then you have a bunch of a handful of brands and their foundations or their treasuries who want to be leaders in this and have the values behind it. But you're talking about a couple $100 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
In total to unlock billions of dollars. And
Correct.
there are a couple individuals and families who are worth billions and billions of dollars. I know
Yes.
it's on paper.
Yes.
I know it's on paper, but once they cash it in, some of that exists. And
Yep.
it's just crazy to me that people who've made their money in this industry and have become some of the richest people in the world. If you look at the list of the richest people in the world, there's always a bunch of apparel entrepreneur families.
Sure.
They should be stepping up. And the fact that they're not shamed into doing it, where they could each put in $50 million and suddenly, whoo, look where we're at.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of baffled, and I'm wondering why that narrative hasn't taken off in our industry,
Yeah.
shaming those who aren't stepping up. And I know I'm
Yeah.
going to give you an out. You don't have to say anything about this, but
I do want
that's
to
how
talk.
I'm feeling.
No, but I do want to talk. I love this, and I find philanthropy really interesting, and the evolution of it. If there's a book in me at some point, it's probably around this whole topic of philanthropy. So here's what I think on this. I think you're absolutely right, and we've seen models for it. Right, look at the Rockefeller family and how they have basically positioned their philanthropic giving through Rockefeller Foundation, as well as some of the other Rockefeller brothers and David Rockefeller and others in the family have used their philanthropy to undo some of the doing of fossil fuel from a family who was Standard Oil, right? And so I think what you've seen is an evolution of a family who understands that the way in which their wealth was primarily made, or at least established, a big part of the foundation for their wealth to amplify and replicate, was on the seed of a particular type of industry, and in this case, fossil fuels. And you now see that same family and their giving under these foundations, and how those foundations have restructured themselves to be leading in climate work and leading in decarbonization. And so that's a great example. One would think that the fashion industry would do the same. And I'm not going to list names, but we have a couple who I think are doing it. And so, but it's only a couple, right? There's a couple families who have made their wealth in this sector, who are now dedicating a good portion of their own and or steering the corporate giving as well into this space. So I think that's good. And I think anyone who's listening, and probably they aren't, but who can get this to those other family members, I think it's an important message that you brought up, which is, if you have a legacy in this and your family has made its wealth and your shareholders have made this wealth on it, be part of the solution to transition this, because it can be done. We're proving this can be done. We have the blueprint to have a healthy, safe, equitable, sustainable fashion industry for the future. There's enough foundational work from circular economy, shared economy, clean production, all the work that all of us have been doing. There's a blueprint for the future, and how exciting to get your family's legacy around that. And it's not just the families out of the North, the West. It's also a lot of the families in Asia and South Asia who are multi-generational, who have been in whose families make the dyes or the polymers or the chemistry or the fertilizers for the fields or whatever. They're all part of this too. And I think if we can excite the next generation, because that's where it's going to come from, is the younger generation of family members who are now stepping into their own power and their own wealth and have their own access to family assets or decision making, to start to be a part of this. It's very exciting. It's not about tearing down what your forefathers have built. It's about systems change and transitioning to something better and more exciting, right? It's about innovation, creativity.
I
And
think this is why you're the president and CEO. You've just done a nice pitch there.
well, thank you.
I'm
So,
just giving you nice positive feedback.
so maybe this is my next campaign. Maybe I need to write the book that gets out there, go on the speaking
Exactly.
tour around this. It's interesting. I mean, in my work, I've run across a lot of people whose privilege was on the backs of, on the backs of colonialization, slavery. I mean, it's like it exists all over the world, and it's not just the people in Europe and the U.S. It's everybody who's part of the system who makes money off of these systems, right? And that's including the people in the countries where it's being made. So I think it's a call for all of us to look at the. I'm going to sound very Northern California and woo-woo with the energy behind our money. There's a fabulous person out here in the Bay Area, Lynn Twist, who's written a book, The Soul of Money. And if you haven't read it, read it. But there is a soul and there is an energy around money, right? And so as we start to think about transitioning into this new economy that we are all building, that we hope we get to in the next 15 to 20 years, because we have urgency around it. And I'll just end this little spiel by saying, when you pointed to the numbers, the 7.81% of our goal achieved, I'm proud of it because I know how much that represents. I know it will be and can be much bigger when more players come in, because we've created a system that we can amplify our work by as much partnership as we have. We're set up now to grow very effectively with AII through also third-party partnerships. It doesn't have to be just building our team. It's also about building regional connections and regional supplier engagement. And so we're excited about that. So these numbers can grow rapidly, and the hockey stick of this fashion climate fund or pooled fund can go up over the next 5 years. I mean, it was always designed that way, that we would do the majority of the heavy lift work 2025 to 2030. But now, as we're sitting here at 2025, I'm slightly nervous that
Because I was going to ask
history won't
you.
reach its goal. Right?
I mean, what you're doing is pioneering. So of course,
Yep.
it makes sense that you're nervous when the catch-up effect hasn't yet happened. But the optimism, you said you have to be an optimist in doing this kind of work to some degree. Given where we are now, you said you're nervous. How optimistic are you that we're going to reach our emission goals by 2030? You think right now, with the considerations, we're not going to get there, but if certain things happen, we will get there? Is that sort of the general feeling you have, or what's your optimistic take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the numbers will probably fall short of, but I also look at it as not all this is not a specific moment in time as much as frankly, it all should have been done 5 years ago, right? And if we're looking at a science-based approach, I mean, we're as a humanity rapidly behind on all of this. I think the next 5 year success is to get enough of these technologies proven in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, not just implemented, but the financing, like to demonstrate it, and to let the replication begin. Because I think that what we are setting up right now, this critical, this is why you don't give up. You're setting up what 2040 is going to look like, and the ability to get to total decarbonization. And so even if on this, chart, this metaphorical visual chart that I have in my head right now of the hockey stick of growth of all this work and the amount of carbon reduction against the amount of financing deployed, and I think we're going to rapidly increase this work in the next 5 years, and that sets the stage for total decarbonization. And that having an organization like AII in place to always look at that next level up technology and how do we get it from pilot to scale, and then allow the industry to take over, is it's critical, and it's all that's going to happen too, right? On top of hitting numbers or not hitting numbers.
Right. Okay. So you may not get the feedback on all the great stuff that's happening until maybe afterwards, but that doesn't mean that things aren't moving at the pace that are needed. That's how I understand what you're saying. Let's do a quick rapid round of some questions, because I know we're running out of time a little bit, and I want to make sure I get your perspectives on a number of different things here.
Right. Great.
Um, One is, you mentioned it, I mentioned it. So this idea of growth and carbon reductions. Um, at a basic level, we've shown, a company can reduce its per product emissions, but if it grows, it without all the other things that need to happen in the supply chain, its total emissions grow.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that's the sector trajectory, but there are those, and it doesn't seem so unthought through, that are saying even with these kinds of work that AI is doing, we'll never really address the footprint of the industry, the emissions of the industry, without reducing the volumes,
Yeah.
without reducing the consumption of this industry that's gone from some call fast to even faster with the ultra fast fashion.
Sure.
Um, do you have a perspective on that? And just give me a quick response. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn out philosophy, but how do you feel about that issue?
Yeah, I do. And, I spent, a decade working on circular economy, cradle to cradle work, and that fits very well with other models of post consumer behavior and how we look at the products that we're buying, engaging with, keeping, sharing, swapping, repairing, all that shared economy work and circular economy work is the critical side piece to this work. And it's really up to the industry, particularly brand retailers, to figure out the business model for success and growth by looking at creating valuable products that are made well, that continue to um, drive profitability, I suppose, to the brand retailer themselves. It's a conundrum for sure, because I think that sufficiency is long overblown. We've blown past the concept of sufficiency when we're working with capitalist models, that the only indicator of success in a brand, in a product or a service, is increased shareholder wealth quarter over quarter. And yet, that's the conundrum that we're in. And so,
So is there a situation where we could actually get pretty far in reducing emissions in the current business model, and there could be an excuse by politicians, policymakers, to say, well, look, the current business model can deliver reduced emissions at the pace and scale required, and so we don't really need to work with this overconsumption issue, this volume, this sufficiency question. Do you see any risk of that? Or we're so far from it that there's no risk from that?
yeah,
Uh,
I
yeah.
don't see that risk, but and I don't think I'm being naive. I think that it's I think it's too far from it might be a good way to say it, in a sense that I think it's the clear mandate at the same time, in my opinion.
Are there things that, given the work now you've done and you're working with a certain group of stakeholders, are there certain asks that you have from policymakers, from other stakeholders that aren't being done that would accelerate your work? Is there anything that comes to mind? And again, our analysis is that although there are, and you maybe say, Mike, you got it wrong. Our analysis is that for at least the brands and retailers to really accelerate this work, and that's also on circular business models, there has to be much more financial rewards or penalties in this space
Yeah.
for climate action. And so you get some of these pioneers that you're working with who are willing to take it as a cost now because they think they'll get the benefits later. They'll have better supplier relationships. They'll reduce risk. Maybe
Yeah.
there'll be legislation that comes where there's a price on carbon for this industry. So they're playing that, but it is still a cost for them, right? They're not making money on this. And so our sense is, why are we still playing this game where we're not rewarding financially good behavior?
Yeah.
Um, do you see that as an issue?
I do, and I think you're pointing at an interesting piece too, which is around the policy work, which you know well, and really at the regional level. I think what I've been surprised to not see, and sometimes the part of me that sees opportunity, which is, should we take this on at AI? And I don't think this is our role, but there are other players, partners that we work with who will hear this and think this is the role that we should play, which is to really focus in on the relationship that the industry has to countries, and specifically around future proofing business. Countries where textile production from farm to cut and sew has been a big part of the economy and a big part of the culture for so long, and it would be disruptive to remove it or replace it or to lose it. To the economy, to the livelihood of the country, to the culture of the country in many ways, done in a fair, equitable, good, future thinking way, right? And I think that it's being missed right now to look at. And you talked about this at the beginning. Where is the blueprint for each of these countries to say we want to maintain ourselves as a producer of this sector? I think what's happening, and now I'm getting into being a pundit, but I think
Okay,
what's happening is that other sectors are much more attractive for countries to recruit and retain. If we could replace
that's right.
our GDP and exports with textiles, with tech and technology, and then how much more exciting and interesting would that be for maintaining our youth who want to actually be educated in this space, who want to participate in this, and not lose them to other countries, or so that we keep
I
our
think that's
talent.
true. I mean, even Lutz Walter from the European Technical Platform, who I interviewed, is saying, the textiles in Europe, it's not people don't consider it a future industry. Young people don't want to work with it. The innovation space is there, but it's not the kind of sort of buoyant, exciting space.
Yeah,
And I can imagine there's as an issue of the mentality in production countries as well, in terms of what the future is, even though
yeah,
so many and so many countries are dependent upon it, and poorer people are dependent upon it. So I hear what you're saying there. But also we have this extra challenge, which is, you mentioned people who've benefited, uh, often in the West, and the North, global North, from this industry's huge development over the last 30 years.
right.
Um, and yet we also know that the heat stress and the climate change is here now in those places. And we're once trying to raise money for decarbonization, but there are other aspects of climate action that are talking about human rights and humanity, that who's going to fund that, right? Who's going to fund adaptation, given that we have trouble funding it at the macro level already. So, oh, Lewis, we could do part one and part two here.
There's a part
Um,
two to what you were just talking about, which I'd love to get into later. We're working on a cost of inaction research right now with Accenture, and Passion for Good is participating with us on that as well too, and a couple other key partners. And there's that gets beyond into some of this that you're looking at too, because the cost of inaction is also related to the impact of climate on these regions, right? So
oh,
that
that's interesting. I
that's a
would
part
love to
two.
follow up on that. Let's see when that comes out, how we can do that. Let me ask you a final question.
Yes, sir.
Are you ready for a final question?
I am.
Okay. So if you could choose anything, right? You had your wish. I don't want to say blank check, even though we talked money. You got your one wish. This is the classic question. In the next 6 months to 2 years or whatever it would take place to dramatically shift and enable this decarbonization and climate action. I want to use a broader term in the industry at the pace and scale needed. What one wish would you make? I know it's a holistic thing. We need to think ecosystems,
Sure,
But you get
yeah.
one thing, Lewis.
Well,
One.
if I'm thinking more immediately around what we're working on right now, and I teased this out when I was talking about EVs and solar panels and rebates and closing the finance deployment, I think, and this is where I'd love to see AII have the opportunity to pool more funding to deploy against closing the finance gap against these proven technologies, because just saying they'll work and lower your carbon and still produce the apparel, product that you're looking to produce in a way that's quality and all is not compelling enough without being able to subsidize this transition right now. And it won't be for everyone. It'll be for the leaders. And to say, can we get enough of the highest producing, high volume leaders to decarbonize as rapidly as possible? We need to carry that transition together, and it's not just one. So, I mean, in the millions of things I could wish for to wave a wand around progress for this work, I do feel like we're narrowing in on something pretty important right now, which is incentivizing the supplier in partnership with the brand retailers that source from them to work together to get them decarbonized as quickly as possible. And I think we've got a great framework for that. I could spend a whole other hour talking about what we did in India last month with our activation project that is setting the stage for this type of work. That I think the more resources we have to go systematically towards this and to really choose the right partners to do this together, it's going to be pretty powerful. And I want to mention, it's not just, the decarbonization, the less bad equals more good. It is, and this kind of ties into the last thing. It's the more good too. And I'm borrowing from William McDonough and Michael Bromgard on that with Cradle to Cradle, which is the more good is also, what does the production of the future look like? What does that innovative, disruptive technology, digitalization of production of apparel look like, borrowing from some of the best practices that are out there right now? And Fashion for Good is working on that, and we're a partner to it with the Factory Blueprint Project. And so there's a lot of really cool things where you could say, let's not just look at reducing the negative impact, let's look at creating the positive impact, and then let's go finance that transition together.
Lewis, we covered a lot of good ground. We have a lot more to talk about, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat about this today.
Thank you, Mike. It's always a pleasure. Always a thoughtful conversation. Thank you.